Okay, so I wanted to do a little bit of a video on something that we get hounded with day in, day out, constantly regarding our GVM and axle load ratings, and what we're seeing from the inquiries coming through all the time is, you know, people often don't understand. They say, well, why does one manufacturer give me, let's use an example of a 4200 GVM on a Land Cruiser, for example, and they use the OE diff, they re-rate the OE diff to give you a couple of hundred extra kilos, and then other companies like J-Max go to the effort of replacing the rear housing and giving you a much higher axle rating. And that carries through to wheels and tyres and other things as well, being load rated. So, and the problem is most people are going and getting a GVM. Normally, often it's based around maybe lack of knowledge or around price. And their price point is, well, here's a GVM and it's half the price of that GVM. It gives me the same numbers on paper when it comes to the GVM outcome and maybe the tow capacity, whatever. But there's this vast difference between the two. The problem comes from the fact that if you're raising a GVM on any vehicle by 600, 900 kilos, and then you're only adding a couple of hundred kilos over the OE manufacturer's specifications, it often doesn't work. So, you know, you end up saying, well, I'm within my GVM and I'm within my GCM, but my axle loads are through the roof. It's because when you load these cars, the manufacturer, and we'll take a 79 dual cab as a really good example due to its axle placement and things like that. Toyota say to you, the GVM is 33 or 3500, whatever that is. And Toyota are going, okay, we've allowed for 5 seats, 5 people in the car. We fit a Toyota bull bar, Toyota side rails, Toyota winch, all that's kind of standard stuff, alloy tray, etc. Now we allow you to put 350 kilos on the ball, and then to load that car beyond Toyota's specifications, the load goes in the back of the car. It can't go in the front of the car, it can't go on the roof, it goes in the rear of the car. So if you're pushing those GVMs into those bigger numbers, where is your loading going to be? It's always going to be in the rear. So adding 600 to 900 kilos onto a GVM and then adding 200 or 300 kilos onto the OE manufacturer's axle load rarely ever works, especially when you start pushing 42 and above. So, you know, we're seeing guys now, dual cabs are a really good example because the axle is nearly directly behind the cab. So all the weight in the rear is behind the axle. Now that weight multiplies. So what it does is that 1 kilo at the tow ball is about 1.4 to 1.5 kilos on the axle, and it creates a counter lever where it's taking weight from the front. So what people think is, oh, but I'm getting extra front weight as well, so we're re-rating the front, we're going from say 1480 to 1550 or 1600, whatever. The car doesn't get heavier in the front. It gets lighter in the front because it gets heavier in the rear, and as the rear gets heavy, it has a tendency to want to pull the front up. So 300s are a classic example of, as you load the rear, it actually raises the front. So you've got to be careful about how much lift you put in the front of a 300 series, because as you load it, it's lifting itself up in the front because it's getting lighter and lighter. And we see that typically with 79 series dual cabs, for example, they might be sitting around 4 ton, 4.2 ton. They're lucky to weigh 1,300 kilos on the front axle because all the weight is backward and it's lifting the front of the car. Poor drivability, all those sorts of things come from that. So that's why, to do your GVM properly, you need to address axle load correctly. You probably see in the background here a bunch of their Ram 1500 diffs, for example. Their axle load is very, very low. And the problem is raising it even higher than what the manufacturer recommends is fraught with problems due to the wheel bearing issues. So, example on the Ram 1500, we take it from 1770 or 1870 up to 2,500 kilos to do 4.2 ton GVM. They need that capacity because if you don't have it, your GVM doesn't mean anything. So we're seeing it all the time, getting calls all the time. I have a GVM, I'm over my axle load, how do I fix it? Here's the problem. If you have a GVM upgrade by company X and it states that the GVM's this, the axle loading's this, and you go and put a heavier diff in the rear to carry more weight, you can't actually get that weight legally applied, or that extra load rating and that diff legally applied to that vehicle. The problem is the data for that GVM was tested at those axle weights and at that GVM. Increasing your rear axle load causes other issues: wheels, tires, suspension, shocks controlling the weight. There's a whole series of things that need to be addressed, and that's why, yeah, you can put a stronger diff and say, oh, I've got, we see it on the Ram, I don't have a GVM, or I have a GVM, but I just want the peace of mind. That's one thing. However, to legally get it on paper, your GVM has to be complete. It must state axle loads, GVM, tow capacity, all those things, and have it as a package so that it all has been tested and worked together. As you get heavier on the rear, you compromise front braking, so you need to ensure and brake test that the front brakes are adequate. In some cases, we add brake boosters and brake upgrades to increase the braking on the front due to the fact that they're so heavy over the rear, and you're removing weight and you're losing braking ability, as 80% of that braking is done on the front. So if you're looking at a GVM, I think we even did it on the 300. We did a classic video that you could look back into our YouTube, where we loaded a 300 series wagon to 4.2 ton. Now what we did is we had a bull bar, we had 35-inch tires on it, we had steel side rails on it, we put 4 or 5 big fellas, about 100 kilos each, into the car. Then we proceeded to put the rest of the load directly in the rear of the car. So it wasn't out the back on the tow ball, it was in the car. So it was absolute best case. And what we found was a 4200 GVM on a 300 series needs 2,600 plus kilos on the rear axle as a bare minimum. Now, a lot of 300 GVMs you see around with re-rated diffs, etc., they're lucky to reach 23, 24, and they're overrated. So those diffs have been eating into the manufacturer's safety rating. I think we rate a 300 series factory OEM diff with no modification at 2,000 kilos due to the fact that it shows signs of issues and stress. Now, our data is no different to anyone else's. The product is the product. However, you'll see there's a vast change in what every company says the OE can do. And that's all based on risk versus reward. How much risk do they take by overrating it, and what's the reward benefits by being, in front of everyone else on the market by doing nothing? So they're always the questions that we're getting all the time. So doing those axle loads, you're wasting your time doing big GVMs without actually considering your axle load specs, having adequate axle loading, and the testing and data to prove it. So if you have any other questions on the topic of axle loads and GVMs, you can contact us at the office or at jmax.com.au, jump on our website, or talk to one of our JMax facilities Australia-wide.